very much for that introduction. Anybody who knows me will probably recognise that my economics are pretty Anglo-Saxon. And although Tony Blair was very complimentary actually to me in his diaries, he did say that in dealing with Gordon Brown I had the diplomatic skills of Dirty Harry. So perhaps you know where I'm coming from in terms of the economics. Now, there's a great deal of attention in the newspapers about the future of the football world and Mr. Blatter. And it seems to me that if one group of people are living in greater sense of denial than Mr. Blatter, it's what my friend Bern Connolly refers to as the Brussels nomenclatura. And that includes politicians in individual countries, and it's particularly in Germany. I want to talk about the implications of Germany. I'm not suggesting that other countries aren't under threat, but I do want to focus on Germany, because it seems to me it's one thing to talk about political unrest in Greece and Portugal. It's quite a different thing to talk about the danger of political unrest in Germany. And it seems to me that German leaders, I suspect not knowingly, are leading, in my view, the German people into a very dangerous world. And I think that one of the problems about this is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the crisis that is confronting us, confronting Europe, and that's reflected in most of the commentary in the British newspapers as well. The nature of this present crisis is not fundamentally one about budget deficits and debts, although they are a shambles, and we all know the Greeks and probably most other countries apart from Germany and Holland lied before this thing set up. But it's not really about that. It's what happens in a monetary union when a country loses competitiveness and loses it in a major way. Now, the peripheral countries, in terms of that, they've got their various differences, but they're all suffering from fundamental loss of competitiveness against their major trading partners, particularly against Germany. Now, the solution they're being put forward, or being asked to implement, is essentially what I refer to as 2/3 of an IMF package. I used to work for Dennis Healy many years ago, which probably destroys any credibility I might still to say. But nonetheless, when the IMF came into Britain, as with other countries, they normally demand three things: cuts in expenditure, rises in taxes, and a depreciation of your currency. And if you can't do the last, which clearly in the European Union can't, all you do is make things worse. Ireland has had 5 austerity budgets. Its budget deficit is now worse than it was, and it started with, and the same will withdrew, Greece and Portugal and the rest. Now, Germany, I think, is a bit misguided. Its view is very much, in a sense, if only every country could behave like Germany, everything will be all right. Well, not every country can have a current account surplus, unless you're going to trade with Mars. And more importantly, that was not actually how Germany got out of its difficulties when the euro started. When the euro started, Germany had been unified. Western Germany, in simple terms, had taken out the clapped-out economy in Eastern Germany, so Germany as a whole was uncompetitive. And it tried to do various things. It tried to improve its labour market, it tried to squeeze its budget, but the real reason that Germany regained its competitiveness was not anything Germany did, it's what others did. Because what happened was that the ECB kept interest rates at a level that was appropriate for Germany, i.e. very low, and that helped weaken the euro, which helped Germany in non-European export markets. Those low interest rates had another effect. It increased inflation in the periphery countries of Europe. So it increased the competitiveness of German goods in those markets. It was a sustained period of low interest rates, not only increased inflation, but set off an asset price and a credit bubble in these areas. So it increased the demand for these newly competitive German goods. And still, Germany did not consolidate its budget deficit. It had to go to the ECOFIN in 2004 and ask not to be fined. I mean, there were any questions of fining, but they had to ask to be fined. Now, the point about that is that Germany's loss of competitiveness was about 1/3 as great as the loss of competitiveness that these countries were now focusing on today: Greece, Spain, and Portugal. Now, what are the solutions? Bailouts won't work, whether they're for 2 years or 3 years, whether they're for 100 billion euros or 700 billion euros, because they do not deal with the competitiveness issues. Structural reforms, we're being told, this is the solution. Europe must reform itself. Clearly it should. All kinds of things could change in Greece and Spain and Portugal. I understand it may be apocryphal, but I understand if you're a forestry worker in Greece, you get a bonus if you work outside. Now, it may be apocryphal, but there's a whole series of things that can be done in Greece and these other countries. But what structural reform, or reform in this sense, is why it's important, is the initial effect of those kinds of reforms is actually to depress your economies. People will get thrown out of work as companies go bust and fear takes over. Now, without monetary policy, that can again be reinforced. And the other thing is that suppose these countries did undertake reform, suppose Greece did do all the things that were necessary, then one of the things that would have happened is that the rates of return on investment in Greece would rise much more quickly than in those countries where reform wasn't taking place, which means that even more necessary for them to have their own monetary policy. Asset side sales are being suggested as a solution. Well, there are quite a lot of assets that Greeks could sell off, but if you think you've got to remember about asset sales, assets by definition have an income stream. And what happens when you move it from the private sector to the public sector, or when you move from anyone? What happens is somebody else gets that income stream. Now, it is perfectly possible that, given that these things are already in the public sector, that if you transfer it to the private sector, then there will be a better rate of return, a better income stream. But the benefit to Greece is only the income stream differential. It is not the 50 or 60 billion that are being talked about. And of course, if foreigners buy these assets, they don't benefit at all, because Greece will not get the benefit of those income streams. So in economic terms, there are only two solutions. One is a massive depreciation of the euro. A small depreciation only helps Germany. So the kind of scale that we're talking about here, to enable these countries, if you like, to regain their competitiveness in another way, would probably mean the euro would have to go down to something like 50 or 60 cents against the dollar, which would simply send inflation skyrocketing in Germany. The other solution is not one-off bailouts, but regular transfers, gifts, rather the way that West Germany gave gifts to East Germany, which incidentally are still running at 60 billion euros a year. But the scale of that is just horrendous. If you assume that if one of these countries went, the rest would go, if you assume that in some sense the current account deficits of these countries were met not by trying to screw their economies down to the ground, not through depreciation, because you couldn't do that, but transfers, you are talking, roughly speaking, about 150 or 200 billion euros a year forever. Forever. And if you imply some kind of reasonable discount rate for one of these things that were, roughly speaking, and it is a broad brush, but roughly speaking, you're talking about 7 or 8% of German GDP, which is rather greater than the reparations that were demanded of Germany and not paid after the First World War. Now, therefore, those two solutions don't seem to me very likely that it would direct Germany. Now, the German solution to this at the moment is more austerity and more lending. Well, more austerity just makes things worse, and you can't enforce it unless there's a new role for the European Army, which I haven't read about, but you can't enforce it. And more lending simply kicks the can down the road, as Mr. Obama refers to it in a different context, obviously. Now, the thing about this, it strikes me as being very odd, is that when this enterprise was set up, it obviously replaced exchange rate risk for credit risk. The thing is, though, that back as far back as 1994, Mr. Trichet said that one advantage of monetary union was that risk premium would go down to zero. That is, there would be no credit risk. And so what has happened is that exchange rate risk has been exchanged for credit risk, but credit risk was mispriced, so we have a credit bubble. And above everything else, the single currency was a credit bubble, on top of anything made in the United States. But the credit bubble's gone bust. But the creditors haven't been hit. And you've got this bizarre position of Irish and other European taxpayers supporting French, German, and many other banks. Now, see, it seems to me this is ultimately not a sustainable position. So what is the best way out of this thing, this mess? And we are in a mess, and there will be no painless way out of the mess. and it'll affect Great Britain as well, although we're not in the euro. Now, the best solution would actually be for Germany to leave the euro, but that isn't going to happen. Partly because the Germans seem to take the view that somehow they can't behave in a German way, they have to operate in a European way, whatever that means. Germany also seems to think that it's somehow benefited from the euro. Now, in a sense, it has, because Germany has used both the euro and the exchange rate mechanism as a way of maintaining German manufacturing. But that has been at the expense of German taxpayers and German consumers. It's certainly true if Germany did come out, the new Deutschmark would appreciate, its manufacturing would become less competitive, but other areas of the economy, the service sector economy, would have to develop, and Germany as a country would be much more prosperous. Now, the other side of this, of course, is that although German manufacturing has been very prosperous and very successful, because in a sense it's used the exchange rate mechanism and the single currency, this current account surplus, or the trade surplus in particular that they've earned, has been channeled into these periphery countries. They are the biggest creditors. So it seems to me that there's a dilemma for Germany. It would be very costly to rescue the German banks and their exposure to these countries, but the longer this goes on, the more expensive it will be for Germany and other countries to rescue sovereign states as they go bust. To that extent, it seems to me, I don't know how it will happen, I have no idea when it will happen, and nor does anybody else, but it seems to me that in its present configuration, the single currency cannot survive. And in fact, within monetary union, Portugal, Spain and Greece are already insolvent, and Ireland is probably insolvent. Now the danger is, or not danger so much, but the likelihood is that, as in every other crisis that Europe has had, will be used to bring about more Europe. A degree of integration that was not acceptable before. And we can see what the French are playing at. The French have always had this desire for economic governance. But it's very important that Germans understand where they're coming from. Mr. de Gaulle said, or President de Gaulle said many, many years ago, that for him, Europe was a coach and horses. And Germany was the horse, and France was the coachman. Now we all know that this whole project was a political one, but it's underpinned by some very bad economics. And ultimately, bad economics leads to bad politics. And this comes on top of a political system that was already, in my view, a lie. Because it's pretended that somehow the European Union is in favour of democracy and the rest of it, and we know at the introduction, the whole course of this enterprise has been one where power has gone from member states to the centre, and indeed we've ended up with the worst of all worlds. You could make a case, I mean a theoretical case, for a federal Europe, but we've ended up with the worst of all worlds. A mixture of supranational, national and bureaucratic, with no accountability and no responsibility. No responsibility to member states or their peoples. And we've reached a time when no means yes. I'd be interested to know what if the vote on the Lisbon Treaty in Ireland had finally gone wrong the second way, whether we'd have said that no means no meant yes. The whole idea that somehow people only vote against this thing when they don't understand it, it's insulting. And I think the other more important point, if I may say so, is that what Europe has done politically is undermine the institutions that define and give expression to national sense of identity without replacing it with something else. And the danger of that whole environment is that when national sense or political sense of identity is undermined, people will seek that identity in other areas, in race, ethnicity, and the tribe. And that is all that will happen. Now we have here the biggest crisis since the 1930s, and in my view we're only beginning to see the beginnings of the political fallout. The European Union has in a sense created a political vacuum in Europe. The single currency has destroyed and is in the process of destroying economies. In that environment, it seems to me, whatever happens in one sense or another, the new Europe, at least for the foreseeable future, will take on connotations that are, in some sense, more German. And I don't think Germany or its peoples really want that, because we are ending up with an environment and a danger and a crisis where Germany either ends up picking the bill, which will ruin it, or it ends up by being the bully that tries to reinforce discipline in other countries. Because once the Germans sign up to economic government, the French will not be concerned about discipline and these other things. They're being taken for a ride. And I think that's very, very dangerous, not just for Europe, but for Germany. It reinforces national stereotypes. I don't imagine that Germany is going to fall into some kind of right-wing, new Hitlerite or whatever. It could be just as left-wing, but the danger of political instability in Germany, I think, is a very real one. And to that extent, it seems to me that it is in the interests of Europe. I mean Europe, not institutional Europe, the real Europe. It is in the interests of Europe and Germany that Germany says no to France on something that really matters to the French. It's often said that the European Union is like riding a bike, that if you stop, you fall off. Well, that is not my experience of riding a bike. It is perfectly possible to stop and put your foot down and look around and see where you want to go. Way back in the 50s, when this whole enterprise was being discussed, there was a choice to be made between the views of Ludwig Erhard, who wanted a much lighter union, a free trade area, and on the other hand, Adenauer. And Adenauer won. And the great paradox is that the model that Erhard envisaged was much more appropriate for a nation of 27 and a world in which capital flows freely and the other developments have taken place than the one we've got. But we got what we've got. It's heading for a crisis. It is unsustainable. And in my view, one of the biggest dangers is actually how the Germans respond. And I'm not sure the German politicians actually understand the danger into which they're leading their people.